I never thought I'd be the kind of person who checks security camera footage before going to bed every night. I'm a 52-year-old railroad engineer. I check gauges, I monitor signals, I watch for obstacles on the track. I don't spy on my own house, or at least that's who I was before my water bill showed up in March. My name is Ray Kowalski. I've worked for Union Pacific for going on 24 years, running freight between Denver and Salt Lake City. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well, and after my wife Sandra passed 6 years ago, the long stretches away from home suited me fine. Less time sitting in a quiet house that used to have more noise in it. I own a 3-bedroom ranch-style home in Aurora, Colorado, a suburb just east of Denver. Nothing fancy. Just a place I've kept up because Sandra would have wanted me to. The yard, the gutters, the furnace filter every 3 months. I do it out of habit more than anything. I'm away from home roughly 18 days out of every month. My runs are long. My layovers are in Salt Lake, and I don't get back to Aurora until the rotation brings me around. My neighbor Helen, a retired school teacher in her late 60s who lives directly across the street, has always kept an eye on things. I'd wave to her when I left. She'd wave when I came back. That was our arrangement. Unspoken but reliable for years, which is why it was strange when Helen didn't call me. She's the type who would call. The water bill came to my phone as a notification on March 11th. I was in a crew rest facility in Grand Junction, lying on a bunk that had seen better decades, scrolling through emails before my next call to duty. The bill was $340. My water bills run about $60. Sometimes $70 in summer if I forget to adjust the sprinkler timer before a run. I sat up and read the number again. $340. I called the utility company that same night. The woman I spoke with was patient and told me the usage had spiked over the previous 6 weeks. Not a leak, she said, at least not the dripping faucet kind. This was sustained daily usage. Showers, toilet flushes, cooking, laundry. The kind of usage that comes from someone living in a house. I told her I lived alone. She suggested I might want to check for a broken supply line or an irrigation issue. I thanked her and hung up, but I didn't call a plumber. I called my son Marcus, who lives in Fort Collins and checks on the house once or twice a month when he's down that way. Marcus, has anything seemed off at the house lately? I asked. He paused. Off how? I don't know. Different. Anything unusual when you've driven by? He was quiet for a moment. Dad, I haven't actually been by in about 5 weeks. Things got busy with the new job. I'm sorry, I meant to tell you. 5 weeks. The spike had started 6 weeks ago. I didn't sleep that night. My mind did the thing it does when something doesn't add up and you don't want to look at it too closely, because the answer might be worse than the question. Had I been robbed? Was the house damaged somehow? Was there a burst pipe I didn't know about, and water had been running somewhere hidden for a month and a half? But the utility company had said it was usage, not a burst. Usage. My next break was in 3 days. I shaved a few hours off my rest period, something you technically shouldn't do, and drove back to Aurora, arriving just after midnight on March 14th. I didn't go to my own driveway. I parked a block and a half away on a side street, then sat in my truck and looked at my house from a distance. The porch light was on. I'd left it on a timer. Then I saw it. The faint blue flicker of a television through the blinds in the living room. I own a television. I do not have it on a timer. I sat there for 20 minutes watching. The light behind the blinds changed channels a few times. Someone was watching TV in my living room at midnight on a Tuesday. I gripped the steering wheel hard enough that my knuckles ached, and I made myself think before I did anything I'd regret. Whatever was happening had apparently been happening for 6 weeks. 6 weeks means it's not random. It means whoever is in there feels comfortable. Comfortable enough to settle in, watch TV, run up my water bill. Going in there alone, in the dark, without knowing who I was dealing with or how many people, that wasn't smart. Sandra always said I was better at patience than I gave myself credit for. I drove to a La Quinta near the highway, checked in, and lay on top of the covers staring at the ceiling until 4 in the morning. The next day I drove to a Home Depot and bought 4 security cameras, 2 indoor, 2 outdoor, plus a doorbell camera that records continuously to cloud storage. I'd read enough about squatter situations to know that if someone was claiming residency, evidence was everything. If I confronted them and they left, I'd have nothing. If I went in and they called police and said they'd been given permission, I'd have a mess that took months to untangle. A detective I'd seen, interviewed on the local news, once said that in residential disputes, documentation was the only thing that mattered. I decided I believed him. I drove to my house at 2 in the afternoon, stood across the street for 15 minutes watching. Nothing moved. I went in through the back door, my key, my lock, moving quietly through my own house the way you move when something feels wrong and you don't want to disturb it yet. The wrongness hit me in the kitchen. There was a cast iron skillet on the stove that wasn't mine, a bottle of hot sauce on the counter that wasn't mine, 2 plates drying in the rack that I had never seen before. I moved to the living room. The couch cushions were on the wrong side. I always keep the firmer ones on the left because my back prefers it. There was a charger cable plugged into the outlet by the end table. My end table. A pair of sneakers. Men's size, maybe 10 or 11, tucked neatly beside the armchair like whoever wore them was trying to be a considerate houseguest. I walked through the rest of the house in a kind of slow, nauseating inventory. The spare bedroom, the one I kept a treadmill in and some of Sandra's boxes I hadn't been ready to sort through, had been rearranged. The treadmill was pushed against one wall. A folding cot was set up in the middle of the room with a sleeping bag on it. There was a small duffel bag on the floor, partially unzipped, clothes visible inside. Someone was sleeping in here, and in the master bathroom, Sandra's bathroom that I'd never changed because I wasn't ready, there was a second toothbrush in the holder next to mine. I had to lean against the doorframe for a moment. Whoever this was had been careful, not reckless, no damage, nothing broken. They were using the guest room, not my bedroom. They brought their own cot. They were living here like someone who understood the rules of temporary occupancy and was trying, in some twisted way, to follow them, which somehow made it worse. A random break-in I could understand. This had thought behind it. I installed all 5 cameras in under 40 minutes, moving fast and quiet. Living room behind the bookshelf. Kitchen above the cabinets on the far wall. Hallway near the spare bedroom. The doorbell camera outside, and one small one in the laundry room positioned toward the back door. Then I left everything exactly as I found it. Didn't touch the skillet, didn't move the sneakers. I walked out the back door, locked it behind me, and drove back to the La Quinta. By 6:47 that evening, the doorbell camera sent me a notification. I watched on my phone as a man came up my front walk. He looked to be somewhere in his mid to late 40s. White guy, heavy-set, wearing a gray hoodie and carrying a plastic grocery bag in each hand like he was coming home from Kroger, which I would later confirm he was. He used a key to let himself in, a key that fit my lock the first try. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around, just walked in and closed the door behind him. Over the next 4 days, I documented his routine the way I document train schedules. He arrived in the late afternoon, always with food. He cooked in my kitchen. Real cooking. Actual meals, not microwave stuff. He watched TV until 10 or 11, then went to the spare room. He was up early. He left by 7:30 every morning, dressed in work clothes, carrying a lunch bag. I still don't know where he went. On the 3rd day, something changed. At 5:15 in the afternoon, a second person showed up. A woman. The doorbell camera caught her clearly, mid-30s, dark hair, work blazer, pulling a rolling briefcase. She knocked instead of using a key. The man answered immediately, like he'd been expecting her. They knew each other well. The body language was easy, familiar. She came inside, and they went to the kitchen table, where she opened a laptop and spread out some papers. Through the kitchen camera, I could see the table, but not read the documents clearly. I zoomed in on every screenshot I could capture. On one, I made out what looked like a lease header. On another, a logo I didn't immediately recognize. a stylized key over the letters FHS. I searched FHS Rental Denver and found it on the second page of results. Furnished Homestays LLC, a corporate housing company that placed traveling professionals into furnished short-term rentals. Their website described them as an alternative to extended stay hotels for business travelers, consultants, and relocation clients. They advertised fully equipped homes with a residential feel. My home. Fully equipped. Residential feel. I searched my address on their site. It wasn't listed publicly, but a cached version of a page I found through a third-party aggregator had it. 3-bedroom ranch, Aurora CO, available for monthly corporate stays. Quiet neighborhood, work-from-home ready, off-street parking. The rate was listed at $2,800 a month, utilities included. Utilities included. My utilities. I did the math sitting in that La Quinta room with my phone and a notepad. 6 weeks at roughly that rate. If they'd had my house continuously occupied since early February, they'd collected somewhere in the neighborhood of $4,000 to $5,000 already. I felt the kind of rage that goes quiet. Not loud, just cold and very, very still. I kept watching. The woman stayed 2 hours. Before she left, the kitchen camera caught part of their conversation. I had to replay it 4 times to get it all. The man said something about the next placement arriving on the 22nd. The woman said that was fine, but reminded him, and I heard this clearly, that the owner's schedule showed him back between the 18th and 20th. They'd need a buffer. Owner's schedule. Someone had access to my schedule. I thought about who that could be. Marcus hadn't been by in 5 weeks, and he didn't know my rotation precisely anyway. I called him when I was coming home, not before. Helen across the street knew I came and went, but not the specific dates. I hadn't told anyone else. Then I remembered something. 6 months ago, when my regular schedule shifted to the longer Salt Lake rotation, I called the property management company I use for one specific thing. They hold a spare key, and I contracted them to send someone for furnace filter changes and any maintenance calls that came up while I was gone. I pay them an annual fee. They're called Keystone Home Services. They've been in the house twice in the past year for minor things. And I had given them a general sense of my rotation when I signed the contract, so they could coordinate access. I went back to the footage I had. The man had received a visitor on the second day, around noon, while I was at the Home Depot buying cameras, ironically enough. Older man, baseball cap. I could just barely make out a logo on the cap's side panel. Zoomed in, enhanced, squinted at it for a long time. Blue and white, 2 letters. Hey H, Keystone Home Services, blue and white logo. I called their main number and told the receptionist I was a homeowner on their client list and I wanted to confirm who my assigned property coordinator was. She told me. His name was Dennis Farwell, 14 years with the company. She said it like it was a selling point. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called my contact at Keystone, the manager I'd originally signed my contract with, a man named Bob Ingram. We'd spoken maybe 4 times over 2 years. I kept it casual. I asked whether any of their coordinators did outside work or had relationships with rental placement companies. There was a long pause. He asked why I was asking. I told him I'd seen an unfamiliar vehicle at my property a couple of times and wanted to make sure it was someone they'd sent. He said he'd look into it and call me back. He called back in 2 hours. His voice had changed. Ray, I need to ask you something directly, he said. Did you authorize any third party to use your property as a rental while you're on assignment? I told him I absolutely had not. There was another pause. We may have a problem, he said. The woman with the rolling briefcase was named Carla Metz. I found her through the Furnished Homestays LLC page, where she was listed as a placement coordinator. She handled client matching and property sourcing for their Denver Metro portfolio. The man staying in my spare room, I learned later through the police investigation, was named Phil Garrett. He was a software consultant from Phoenix on a 4-month contract with a company in the Denver Tech Center. He had no idea anything was wrong. He paid Furnished Homestays a legitimate deposit and monthly fee. He thought he'd rented a house legally. The connection between Dennis Farwell at Keystone and Carla Metz at Furnished Homestays turned out to be simple and ugly. Dennis had been a coordinator for Keystone for 14 years. He had access to client property information, spare keys, and in many cases, general notes about owner schedules that property managers kept on file. Carla had approached him. This came out in the investigation about 8 months before I noticed anything. She'd offered him a flat finder's fee for every property he could reliably slot into their portfolio while the owners were away. He'd started small. 1 house. Then 2. By the time Detective Salinas at the Aurora Police Department closed the initial investigation, there were 7 properties. 7 households where someone had been living while the owners were away on work rotations, traveling for family or serving overseas. A nurse in Henderson who was working a contract in Minneapolis. A couple who snowbirded in Florida every winter. A divorced father who split time between Aurora and his new place in New Mexico. All of them had used some version of Keystone or an affiliated property services company. All of them had spare keys and an access system Dennis Farwell could reach. I went to the Aurora PD on March 19th with a folder full of printed screenshots, a USB drive with video footage, and my phone showing the original water bill notification. The detective assigned to me, Salinas, was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, she looked at the evidence for a while and then said that this was the most documented case of this type she'd seen walk through the door. "We can work with this," she said. The sting took 3 weeks to organize. Police coordinated with Keystone's ownership who cooperated fully once they understood the scope of what Dennis had done. They confirmed he had accessed client files outside normal service parameters and had been providing property availability windows to an outside party. Carla Metz, through subpoenas to Furnished Homestays, had been collecting fees from corporate clients for properties she had no legal right to rent. Her company's records showed gross income of just over $190,000 over the previous 8 months across all 7 properties. The operation ended on April 9th, a Wednesday. Phil Garrett was in the living room watching something on my television. His stay was supposed to end the following week when Aurora PD knocked on the door. Carla was there too, coincidentally, doing what the police later described as a routine property check-in. Dennis Farwell was arrested at his home the same morning. I was parked up the street when it happened. A detective called me when the scene was secure. "You can come down now," he said. I drove to my own driveway for the first time in 5 weeks. The door was open. Police were inside. Phil Garrett was sitting on my porch, and when I walked past him, he looked up at me with an expression I still think about. Not defiant, just completely hollowed out. He said he didn't know. I believe him. He really didn't know. He thought he'd done everything right. He'd used a company with a professional website and a contract and a customer service number. He'd paid on time. He was, in his mind, a legitimate tenant. Carla had made sure he believed that. I went inside and stood in my kitchen. The cast iron skillet was still on the stove. The legal process moved the way legal processes do, slowly, with continuances and motions and dates that got pushed. Carla Metz was charged with fraud, theft, and multiple counts of trespassing across properties. Dennis Farwell was charged with breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy, and theft by deception. Keystone Home Services terminated him immediately and issued written apologies to all 7 affected homeowners, though they also lawyered up fast, which told me their cooperation had limits. The 7 of us, all the affected homeowners, connected through the detective's office. There was a group email thread for a while. Amanda, the nurse from Henderson, told me she'd come back from her contract in Minneapolis to find a used coffee maker she'd never bought sitting on her counter. She'd assumed her son had left it there. He hadn't. Marcus Thompson, the divorced father from New Mexico, discovered that someone had gone through the accordion folder where he kept personal documents in his home office. His Social Security number had been used in a credit application he caught only because of an alert on his monitoring service. Nobody from the Furnished Homestays side ever admitted to that. The financial restitution was ordered the following December. My share was $11,400, which covered the water bill spike across all the months, the cost of rekeying every lock in the house, the security system I'd installed and then expanded, and something the court called documented residential disruption. It sounds clinical. It wasn't. I sold the house in August. I want to be clear about that decision because people who know me were surprised. Ray, you've lived there 12 years. You and Sandra picked that house. You're going to let some criminal run you out of it? And I understand why it sounds like losing. But standing in that kitchen knowing that a man I'd never met had cooked dinner in there for 6 weeks, had used Sandra's bathroom, had slept 10 feet from where I kept her things in boxes I still hadn't sorted. I couldn't make that go away. The house didn't feel like mine anymore, in the way that a house has to feel like yours in order to be worth anything. I bought a condo in a building with a staffed front desk, key fob access, and cameras in every common area. I installed my own cameras inside. I check them when I'm in Salt Lake. I check them before I go to sleep. My son Marcus thinks I've gone overboard. Maybe I have, but there's a version of overboard that is actually just accurate. There are things I should have done differently, and I've thought about them enough times to know them precisely. The water bill alert should have been my first call to action, not a thing I sat on while I tried to rationalize an explanation. A $280 spike in a house where one person lives alone and is gone 18 days a month is not a broken sprinkler head. I knew that. I told myself maybe. I wasted 3 weeks telling myself maybe. If you travel for work and you own a home, check your utility usage monthly. Not quarterly. Not when the bill surprises you. Monthly. Set a baseline average and set an alert for anything over 30% above it. It takes 10 minutes, and it's the only reason I found out when I did instead of 6 months later. The spare key arrangement was the real vulnerability. I handed a key to a company and told them my schedule because that's what the contract asked for, and it seemed reasonable. It is reasonable until one employee decides that access to homes plus knowledge of schedules is worth more than his job security. The better system is smart locks, digital codes that you issue and revoke yourself with access logs you can check remotely. If I had installed one of those before my first long rotation, I would have seen within days that my door was being accessed when it shouldn't have been. Verify your property is not listed on rental platforms. I know it seems like something that wouldn't happen to you. Go check anyway. Type your home address into Airbnb, Vrbo, Furnished Home Stays, and whatever corporate housing aggregators show up when you search short-term rental Denver or whatever your city is. It takes 4 minutes. If your address appears anywhere, that's your answer. Build an actual relationship with your neighbors, not just a wave. Helen across the street knew me well enough to notice when something was different about my house, but she didn't have my phone number. She had no way to reach me directly. If she'd been able to call or text me, I might have known something was wrong in February instead of March. That's a month I can't get back. And if you discover something like this, someone in your home, access being used without your authorization, don't confront it alone. I know the instinct. I felt it so strongly that night I parked up the street and watched my TV flicker through the blinds. Everything in me wanted to go knock on my own door and make it stop immediately. But the moment you confront without documentation is the moment you lose the legal high ground. Document first. Get the cameras in, record the pattern, then call the police with something they can actually use. The detective who handled my case told me afterward that the reason the charges stuck and the restitution was ordered was almost entirely because of the footage I collected. Without it, she said, this is a civil matter at best. With it, it's a criminal case with 7 counts. I still drive the Denver to Salt Lake route. I still spend more nights away from home than in it. That's the job. And the job is what lets me own a place to come back to. But I come back differently now. I check the app before I pull into my spot. I know what the door camera saw while I was gone. I know whether the front hallway sensor triggered anything overnight. I know before I put the key in the lock what I'm walking into. That's not paranoia. That's what it costs to feel safe after someone has taken that from you. The last thing I'll say is about Phil Garrett. I know he was the one sleeping in my spare room. I know he cooked in my kitchen and watched my TV and walked past Sandra's bathroom 1,000 times, not knowing anything about the woman whose things were still packed in boxes in the next room. I know all of that. And I don't have any anger left for him. He was deceived as completely as I was. He paid real money for what he thought was a legitimate home. He left a place in Phoenix to come to Denver for a job, and he tried to do everything right. The anger I have left, and it's not as hot as it used to be, but it's still there, is for the people who designed that deception, who looked at the gap between a man who trusts the people he hires and an empty house in a quiet suburb and decided that gap was a business opportunity, who used someone's key, someone's schedule, someone's life as inventory. My father built his house with his own hands in 1971 in a small town in Pennsylvania. He'd grown up during a time when what you built was yours, completely and without question, and no one needed to be reminded of that. I didn't understand the weight of that feeling until someone tried to take it from me. I understand it now. I've had a long time to sit with what happened, long enough to stop being surprised by it and start understanding it. What Dennis did wasn't impulsive. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to betray the people who trusted him. He built toward it slowly, the way people usually do when they're convincing themselves that something wrong is actually fine. He had access. He had schedules. He had keys that opened doors to other people's lives. And Carla showed up with money and a business model and a way to make it all sound reasonable. That's how it works. Nobody hands you a key to someone else's home and says this is theft. They say this is an opportunity. They say the owner is never there anyway. They say nobody gets hurt. People always get hurt. What I keep coming back to is the chain of it. Every single thing that happened traced back to one original decision I made without thinking hard enough, handing my schedule and my spare key to a company whose individual employees I had never vetted, never met, never had any real way to monitor. I trusted the institution without thinking about the people inside it, and Dennis Farwell was a person inside it who had been there 14 years and knew exactly what he had access to and eventually decided to use it. That's not bad luck. That's a gap I left open. The thing about gaps is that most of the time, nothing walks through them. Most of the time, your property coordinator changes your furnace filter and locks up and goes home, and that's the end of it. So you stop thinking about the gap. You assume that because nothing bad has happened, nothing bad can happen. And then someone like Carla comes along who specifically looks for gaps, who has made a career out of finding exactly that kind of unexamined trust, and everything you didn't bother to protect becomes inventory. What I learned from Ray, from myself, I suppose, is that being careful isn't the same as being afraid. I used to think paranoia was weakness. Checking the cameras, questioning the systems, auditing the people who have access to your life. It felt like living small, like not trusting anyone. But there's a version of trust that isn't really trust at all. It's just inattention dressed up to look like faith in people. Real trust has to be earned and occasionally verified. That's not cynicism. That's just how adults are supposed to operate. The courage it takes to document something instead of confronting it immediately, to slow yourself down when every instinct says act now, that's harder than people think. I sat in a parking lot watching my own television flicker through my own blinds, and I made myself drive away. I made myself be patient. I made myself build the case instead of making a scene. And because I did that, 7 families got justice instead of one man getting a story about the night he scared a squatter away. Phil Garrett didn't belong in my house, but he also wasn't my enemy. Carla put him there. Dennis handed her the key. The anger has to go in the right direction, and getting that right takes more self-control than most people give it credit for. I'm not the same person I was before March. I don't think I'll ever check into a hotel on a layover without wondering, for just a second, what my door camera is seeing back home. That reflex doesn't go away. But I've made my peace with it. Some experiences change the way you move through the world, and the only real question is whether you let them make you smaller or more deliberate. I chose deliberate.